stuff.
Ma'am, we've had multiple noise complaints from this address tonight.
That's not possible. Everyone's asleep. You do not have permission to come in here.
We've been out here twice already. Don't argue with me. Let us check inside.
No.
Not without a warrant. Step back right now.
Sir.
You're being
Yes.
uncooperative.
Hey, move.
You can't. Out of the
This is
way.
my house.
Ma'am.
At 7:32 p.m. on the dot, the doorbell rang. Judge Rebecca Lawson had just finished reviewing the case files for tomorrow's hearing when the chime echoed through her quiet suburban home. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her husband was away on business, and her adult children lived in different states. Setting down her reading glasses, she walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. Two police officers stood on her porch, their uniforms crisp and their badges glinting under the porch light. The taller officer, a man in his early 40s with graying at the temples, held a clipboard. His partner, a younger woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood slightly behind him, scanning the surrounding neighborhood. Rebecca undid the deadbolt and opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock fastened. She asked if she could help them. The older officer introduced himself as Sergeant David Kane and his partner as Officer Lisa Rodriguez. He said they were responding to a noise complaint from the neighborhood and needed to speak with the homeowner. Rebecca found this odd. Her house had been perfectly quiet all evening. She had been reading in her study with classical music playing softly in the background, nothing that could have possibly disturbed her neighbors. She told the officers there must be some misunderstanding. Her home had been peaceful all evening, and she was there alone while her husband was out of town. Sergeant Kane looked down at his clipboard and read her address from it, confirming they were at the right place. He said that multiple neighbors had called to report loud music and shouting coming from this specific address. Rebecca knew this was impossible. She asked which neighbors had complained, but Kane said he couldn't disclose that information. Something in his tone put her on edge. She had been a judge for 15 years and a prosecutor before that. She knew when something felt off, and this entire interaction had felt wrong from the start. Before we dive into what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to take some incredible turns you absolutely will not want to miss. What began as a simple noise complaint would end up destroying multiple careers and exposing a corruption scandal that reached the highest levels of local law enforcement. Judge Rebecca Lawson was no ordinary citizen. At 53, she had built an impeccable reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the state. She had presided over high-profile cases involving organized crime, political corruption, and civil rights violations. Judge Lawson was known for being fair, well-prepared, and having zero tolerance for misconduct from anyone, including law enforcement officers who tried to bend the truth. She lived in Millbrook Heights, an upscale neighborhood where she had resided for over a decade. Her neighbors knew her well. She hosted the annual block party, contributed to community fundraisers, and meticulously maintained her property. The idea that multiple neighbors would complain about noise coming from her house wasn't just unlikely, it was preposterous. Standing at her door that night, Rebecca made a decision that would later prove to be crucial. She asked the officers to wait a moment while she got her phone. She wanted to call her immediate neighbors to verify if anyone had actually made a complaint. It was a reasonable request from a homeowner trying to understand the situation. Sergeant Kane's reaction was immediate and telling. He became agitated and told her that wouldn't be necessary. He said they needed to come inside and investigate now. When Rebecca asked if they had a warrant, Kane's demeanor changed completely. His voice grew louder, more aggressive. He said they didn't need a warrant to investigate a noise complaint and that she was being uncooperative. Rebecca remained calm but firm. She explained that since she was not committing a crime and there was clearly no ongoing disturbance, she would not be letting them in without a warrant. She offered to provide her contact information so they could follow up through proper channels if they needed to. That's when Sergeant Kane made his first critical mistake. He stuck his foot in the doorway, preventing her from closing the door. Rebecca immediately told him to remove his foot and step back from her property. Instead of complying, Kane pushed the door open, breaking the chain lock. Officer Rodriguez followed him inside without hesitation. But what these officers didn't know was that Judge Rebecca Lawson had recently installed a comprehensive security system throughout her entire home. Multiple cameras with audio recording capabilities covered every room and entryway. Every second of what happened next was being recorded in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. Kane demanded to see Rebecca's identification immediately. When she asked why ID was necessary for a noise complaint in her own home, he said she was acting suspiciously and they needed to verify she lived there. The implication of that statement would become clear later, but Rebecca understood it immediately. She calmly walked over to her handbag and retrieved her driver's license, which clearly showed her name and the address where they were standing. Cain studied it for an unusually long time before handing it back. Then he asked what she did for a living. Rebecca found the question completely inappropriate and irrelevant to any noise complaint, but she answered truthfully. She said she was a judge. The reaction from both officers was immediate and unmistakable. Cain's eyes widened, and Rodriguez took a step back. Cain asked her to repeat what she had just said. Rebecca stated clearly that she was a circuit court judge and had been for 15 years. She again pressed them on why they were really in her home and demanded to see the complaint report. That's when the situation took a dramatic turn. Instead of apologizing and leaving, Sergeant Cain doubled down. He said he didn't believe she was a judge and demanded additional proof. He said anyone could claim to be anything and that she was still acting suspiciously. Officer Rodriguez began walking around Rebecca's living room, examining her belongings without permission. Rebecca had reached her limit. She told both officers firmly that they were illegally trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She said she would be filing a formal complaint with their department and that their behavior was completely unacceptable. Cain responded by saying she was being aggressive and that he could arrest her. He said she would be charged with obstruction of a police investigation. What happened next would become the centerpiece of multiple federal lawsuits. Rebecca walked to her home office and returned with her judicial identification badge and her business card. She handed them to Cain, who examined them closely. The badge was official, issued by the state court administration. Her business card clearly identified her as the Honorable Rebecca Lawson, circuit court judge. Cain looked at the credentials for nearly a full minute as Rodriguez looked over his shoulder. Rebecca could see the recognition dawning on their faces. But instead of apologizing and leaving, they made another disastrous decision. Cain claimed the identification could be fake and said they needed to verify her identity through official channels. Rebecca told them they were free to call the courthouse, the sheriff's office, or even the mayor's office to verify who she was. Any one of those agencies could have confirmed her position instantly. Instead, Cain said they would need to take her down to the station for proper identification. At this point, Rebecca knew she was dealing with police officers who were either criminally corrupt or dangerously incompetent. She told them in no uncertain terms that she was not going anywhere and that they were violating multiple laws by remaining in her home. She said she was calling her lawyer and the chief of police immediately. Cain's response was to tell her she was under arrest for obstruction of justice. The audio recording clearly captured Rebecca repeatedly stating her position as a judge and her demand for the officers to leave her property. But Cain and Rodriguez had committed to a path of no return. They were determined to see through an action that would destroy their careers and expose a pattern of behavior that had been hidden from public view for years. What they didn't realize was that Judge Rebecca Lawson had been investigating police misconduct in her own courtroom for months, and she recognized both of their names from complaints that had crossed her desk. The next few minutes would be captured from multiple camera angles as Rebecca was placed in handcuffs in her own living room by two officers who had no legal reason to be there in the first place. This footage would later be played in federal court, analyzed by constitutional experts, and broadcast on national news programs. Have you ever witnessed police misconduct firsthand? If so, type yes in the comments. Because what happened to Judge Lawson that night was just the beginning of a story that would unravel a web of corruption that went far beyond these two officers. As Cain snapped the handcuffs on Rebecca's wrists, she continued to state, clearly and calmly, that she was a circuit court judge who was being illegally arrested. The irony was not lost on either officer, but they had made their choice. They were going to see this through, regardless of the consequences. The fallout as Judge Lawson was led to the patrol car in handcuffs. Her neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook Heights that something was happening at the judge's house. Several residents pulled out their cell phones and began recording. Mrs. Henderson from next door called out to ask if Rebecca was okay. Mr. Chun from across the street yelled that there must be a mistake. Sergeant Cain told the gathering crowd to disperse and mind their own business. But these weren't random passersby. They were Rebecca's neighbors, people who had known her for over a decade. They knew she was a respected judge, and they knew this situation was deeply wrong. 3 different neighbors each called the courthouse's emergency line to report that Judge Lawson was being arrested at her home. The ride to the police station was captured on the patrol car's dashcam. Rebecca sat in the back, still in handcuffs, calmly explaining to the officers that they were making a career-ending decision. She told them about the security cameras in her home that had recorded everything. She warned them that the illegal arrest of a sitting judge was a federal crime that could lead to decades in prison. Kane dismissed her warnings, saying she could tell her story to the booking sergeant. Rodriguez remained silent, but the dashcam captured her casting several nervous glances at Kane. She was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done, but it was too late to turn back now. At the station, things went from bad to catastrophic. The desk sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Michael Torres, recognized Rebecca the moment she was brought in. His face went pale when he saw her in handcuffs. Torres had appeared in Rebecca's courtroom dozens of times over the years. He knew exactly who she was and what her arrest meant for everyone involved. Torres quietly asked Kane to step aside for a private conversation. The lobby cameras captured their heated discussion, though the audio was not clear. Torres was gesticulating wildly, while Kane appeared defensive and agitated. A few minutes later, Torres returned to his desk and began making phone calls. The first was to the chief of police. The second was to the mayor. The third was to the district attorney. Within 30 minutes, the police station lobby looked like a convention of local government officials. The police chief arrived first, followed closely by the mayor, the district attorney, and 2 city council members. Every one of them took one look at Judge Rebecca Lawson sitting in handcuffs and understood that a political earthquake was about to shake their community. Chief Williams immediately ordered Rebecca's handcuffs to be removed and personally apologized. He assured her that a full investigation would begin immediately and that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. But Rebecca was far from satisfied. Her life had been turned upside down. She had been illegally arrested in her own home by officers who refused to accept her credentials and ignored her repeated explanations of who she was. The chief asked if Rebecca would be willing to discuss the situation privately in his office. She agreed, but only on the condition that her lawyer be present. She called her longtime friend and legal colleague, David Brennan, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the state. Brennan arrived within the hour, and what he found when he reviewed the initial reports was shocking even to him. In the chief's office, Rebecca laid out exactly what had happened from the moment the officers appeared at her door. She described the fabricated noise complaint, the forced entry into her home, the refusal to accept her identification, and the illegal arrest. Chief Williams listened with growing horror as the details emerged. But the real bombshell came when Rebecca revealed something else. For the past 6 months, she had been quietly documenting a pattern of misconduct involving specific officers in the department. Sergeant Kane's name had appeared in multiple complaints that had crossed her desk. Citizens had filed reports alleging that he had targeted them based on racial profiling, conducted illegal searches, and filed false reports. Rebecca had been planning to bring these concerns to the chief's attention through official channels, but now she was a victim of the very misconduct she had been investigating. The irony was staggering, and the legal implications were so profound that it was hard to believe Rebecca could have committed such a crime. Attorney Brennan requested copies of all reports related to the night's events, including the initial noise complaint. When Chief Williams checked the system, he discovered something that sent a shockwave through the room. There was no noise complaint on file. No neighbor had called. No report had been generated. The entire premise for the officer's visit to Rebecca's home had been fabricated. This discovery transformed the situation from a case of mistaken identity or poor judgment into clear evidence of criminal activity. Kane and Rodriguez had deliberately targeted Judge Rebecca Lawson's home under false pretenses. The question on everyone's mind in that room, but which no one dared to ask, was simple: why? The answer would emerge over the following weeks as federal investigators took over the case. What they found was a web of corruption that went far beyond one night and 2 officers. Kane was part of a group within the department that had been systematically targeting successful African American residents in upscale neighborhoods. Judge Rebecca Lawson was African American, one of only 3 black judges in the entire circuit. She lived in a predominantly white neighborhood and drove an expensive car. She had been targeted specifically because Kane and his associates did not believe a black woman could have legitimately afforded to live where she did. The investigation revealed that Kane had approached at least 15 other prominent black residents under various false pretenses over the past 2 years. He had conducted illegal searches, filed false reports, and in some cases, made arrests that were later dismissed for lack of evidence. The pattern was clear, systematic, and meticulously documented in his own police reports. Once federal prosecutors understood the scope of the conspiracy, they moved quickly. Just 5 days after the incident at Rebecca's home, Kane was arrested at his own home. Rodriguez was arrested the same day. Both were charged with civil rights violations, conspiracy, false imprisonment, and deprivation of rights under color of law. These were federal charges that carried a maximum sentence of up to 20 years for each defendant. But the story was far from over, because Cain and Rodriguez had not acted alone. The investigation expanded to include other officers who had participated in or covered up similar incidents. Phone records showed that Cain had been in contact with a network of officers across multiple precincts who shared his views and methods. Text messages recovered from his phone contained explicitly racist language and detailed plans to target specific individuals and communities. One message thread was dedicated to Rebecca, referring to her as an uppity target who needed to be taught a lesson. The messages revealed that Cain had been surveilling her home for weeks, learning her routine, and waiting for an opportunity to confront her when she was alone and vulnerable. The depth of the conspiracy shocked even seasoned federal investigators. This was not a case of individual officers making bad decisions. This was an organized campaign to intimidate and harass successful Black residents using the power and authority of law enforcement. The arrest of Judge Rebecca Lawson had inadvertently blown the lid off one of the most significant police corruption scandals in the state's history. But the personal cost to Rebecca was immense, and the legal battle was just beginning. The question now was whether the justice system would hold these officers accountable and deliver meaningful consequences for their actions. As news of the arrests spread through the community, more victims began to come forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. With each new revelation, the scope of the conspiracy grew larger, and it became clear that what had happened to Rebecca was just the tip of the iceberg. A very large iceberg. The federal investigation proceeded with a speed and scope that were unprecedented. Within 2 weeks of Rebecca's arrest, FBI agents executed search warrants on Cain's home, Rodriguez's apartment, and the personal devices of 17 other officers across 4 different precincts. What they found painted a picture of corruption so widespread that even veteran investigators were stunned by its breadth and organization. Cain's computer contained detailed files on more than 60 prominent Black residents throughout the metropolitan area. Each file included photographs, home addresses, vehicle information, work schedules, and what Cain called threat assessments. These threat assessments had nothing to do with actual criminal activity and everything to do with how successful or visible these individuals were in their communities. Dr. Michael Franklin, a renowned cardiovascular surgeon, had been pulled over 11 times in 2 years on his way to and from the hospital, where he performed life-saving surgeries. Each stop resulted in lengthy vehicle searches and delays, sometimes for hours. Cain's files showed that these stops were coordinated and deliberate, designed to harass and intimidate. Sarah Washington, a successful real estate developer who built affordable housing in underserved communities, had been subjected to bogus code enforcement inspections and fraudulent investigations into her business practices. Cain's records showed that he had been feeding false information to various city departments to trigger these harassing activities. The list went on. Business owners, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and community leaders had all been systematically targeted. The common thread was not criminal activity or legitimate law enforcement concerns. The common thread was success, prominence, and the color of their skin. Attorney David Brennan worked around the clock, building the federal case while also preparing civil lawsuits on behalf of Rebecca and a growing list of victims. The evidence was overwhelming, but Brennan knew that police corruption cases often hit unexpected roadblocks. There was qualified immunity to protect officers, sympathetic colleagues who might tamper with evidence, and union lawyers who specialized in minimizing consequences. But this case was different. The video evidence from Rebecca's security system was clear, irrefutable, and damning. The text messages between the officers were explicit and undeniable. And the pattern of behavior was so extensive that it could not be explained away as isolated incidents or poor judgment. Judge Rebecca Lawson made a decision that surprised everyone, including her own lawyer. She announced that she would continue to preside over her regular caseload while the federal prosecution proceeded. Many had urged her to take a leave of absence, to step away from the bench until the situation was resolved. But Rebecca refused. She explained that stepping down would send the wrong message to the community and to other potential victims. It would suggest that the officers had succeeded in intimidating her, that their tactics had worked. Instead, she was going to demonstrate that justice would not be derailed by corruption and that the rule of law was stronger than the criminal actions of any individual officer. The decision presented some logistical challenges. Security had to be increased around the courthouse, and Rebecca was given a 24/7 protective detail of federal marshals who screened everyone entering her courtroom. But she was determined to show that democracy and justice would continue to function despite the attempts of some to undermine them. Her first day back on the bench was a national media event. Reporters packed the gallery, news cameras lined the courthouse steps, and legal experts offered commentary on the unprecedented situation. A sitting judge who had been illegally arrested was now presiding over cases while her arresting officers faced federal prosecution. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. Rebecca used her platform to speak about justice, fairness, and the importance of holding everyone accountable under the law, regardless of their position or power. Her words resonated far beyond her courtroom and became a rallying cry for police reform advocates across the country. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Cain and Rodriguez moved forward quickly. Federal prosecutors assembled a team of 8 attorneys to handle the complex conspiracy charges. The evidence was so extensive that they needed multiple prosecutors just to organize and present it effectively. Cain's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal early in the proceedings. He argued that his client was a decorated officer who had made some bad decisions under pressure. He claimed that Cain had never intended to target anyone based on race, and that the text messages had been taken out of context. The prosecution immediately rejected these offers. The evidence clearly showed premeditation, organization, and a systematic pattern of targeting based on race. This was not a case of implicit bias or unconscious prejudice. This was deliberate, calculated criminal activity that had violated the civil rights of dozens of victims. Rodriguez's situation was slightly different. Her lawyer argued that she was a junior officer following the orders of a superior. Phone records showed that she had expressed misgivings and concerns about some of Cain's methods in private conversations with her family. Her lawyer positioned her as someone who had been swept up in Cain's conspiracy rather than an active participant. But the prosecution had evidence that Rodriguez had participated willingly in multiple incidents beyond Rebecca's arrest. She had conducted illegal searches, filed false reports, and helped coordinate surveillance on targeted individuals. Her junior status might be a mitigating factor at sentencing, but it did not absolve her of her criminal actions. The investigation moved beyond the 2 arresting officers as more evidence came to light. Detective James Mitchell had been feeding Cain confidential information about affluent black residents obtained through illegal database searches. Officer Robert Hayes had falsified incident reports to cover up illegal stops and searches. Sergeant Lisa Coleman had supervised several of the targeted operations and helped coordinate the conspiracy. Each new arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Officers who had once felt protected by the blue wall of silence now feared that they too would be exposed. Some began to cooperate with federal investigators, offering information about other crimes and cover-ups. The police union initially defended all the arrested officers, issuing statements about due process and the presumption of innocence. But as more evidence became public, the union leadership began to distance itself from the conspiracy. They eventually hired separate lawyers and focused on protecting the officers who had not been involved in the criminal scheme. Public pressure mounted for broader reforms within the police department. Community leaders called for Chief Williams's resignation, arguing that such widespread corruption could not have existed without his knowledge or negligence. City council meetings became heated forums for discussing police accountability and civilian oversight. Chief Williams announced a full review of all cases handled by the arrested officers over the past 5 years. The review would examine thousands of arrests, searches, and incident reports to identify additional victims and possible wrongful convictions. The scope of this undertaking was staggering and would take years to complete. Judge Rebecca Lawson used her position to advocate for systemic changes that went beyond just prosecuting the guilty officers. She spoke at police training academies about constitutional rights and due process. She worked with community organizations to improve police-community relations. She became a national voice for judicial reform, all while continuing to handle her regular judicial duties. The media coverage was intense and mostly supportive of Rebecca's courage in pursuing justice. National news programs featured her story as an example of how corruption can be exposed and addressed when victims refuse to be silenced. Civil rights organizations praised her for her determination to seek accountability rather than accept a quiet settlement. But not all the attention was positive. Rebecca received threatening phone calls and emails from people who supported the arrested officers. Some of the messages contained racist slurs and explicit threats of violence. Federal investigators took these threats seriously and increased her security detail. The criminal trial was scheduled to begin 6 months after the initial arrests. Prosecutors announced that they would be seeking the maximum sentences allowed under federal law. For the most serious charges, Cain faced up to 25 years in federal prison. Rodriguez and the other defendants faced sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. The trial would be held in federal court, and the jury would be selected from the broader metropolitan area, not just the local community. This was important because many potential local jurors might have ties to law enforcement or strong opinions about the case based on the extensive media coverage. As the trial date approached, more victims continued to come forward with their stories of harassment and intimidation. The prosecution's witness list grew to include more than 40 individuals who had been targeted by the conspiracy. Each testimony would demonstrate the systematic nature of these crimes and the devastating impact they had on the lives of the victims. Dr. Franklin would testify that he had missed critical surgeries because of Cain's harassing stops. Sarah Washington would describe how the fraudulent investigations had cost her millions in project delays and damaged business relationships. Other victims would share stories of humiliation, fear, and the constant stress of being targeted by the very people who had sworn to protect them. The defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern was undeniable, and the victims were credible and sympathetic. Their best hope was to mitigate their clients' sentences by emphasizing cooperation and taking responsibility. But Cain refused to take any responsibility for his actions. He maintained that he had been conducting legitimate law enforcement activities and that any targeting was based on suspicious behavior, not race. This position made it impossible for his lawyer to negotiate any meaningful plea deal. The trial was poised to be a watershed moment for police accountability and civil rights enforcement. Legal experts predicted that its outcome would influence how similar cases were prosecuted across the country. The stakes were enormous, not just for the defendants, but for the broader cause of justice and equality under the law. Judge Rebecca Lawson continued her work through it all, knowing that her strength and resolve were being watched by victims, advocates, and potential future targets of police misconduct. She had become a symbol of resistance to corruption and a testament to the fact that even the most powerful institutions can be held accountable when people refuse to accept injustice. The conspiracy that began with a fabricated noise complaint had grown into one of the most significant police corruption cases in decades. But the real test would come in the courtroom, where the evidence would be presented, the witnesses would testify, and a jury would decide if justice would truly be served. And served it was. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February. The federal courthouse was surrounded by news vans, protesters, and curious onlookers who had been following the case for months. Inside, the courtroom was packed with victims, family members, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials, all there to see how this unprecedented case would unfold. Lead prosecutor Amanda Sterling stood before the jury during her opening statement and painted a picture of systemic corruption that shocked even those who thought they knew the full scope of the conspiracy. She explained how Cain and his associates had operated like an organized crime syndicate, using their badges and authority to terrorize innocent citizens simply because of the color of their skin. Sterling told the jury they would see text messages in which Cain referred to successful black residents as targets who needed to be reminded of their place. They would hear testimony from victims whose lives had been disrupted, businesses damaged, and families traumatized by the very officers who had sworn to serve and protect them. And most importantly, they would see the video evidence that captured the conspiracy in action. Cain's defense attorney, Robert Kessler, faced an uphill battle from the moment he stood up. He tried to argue that his client was a dedicated officer who had made some poor decisions but had never acted with criminal intent. He claimed the text messages were taken out of context and that the targeting was based on legitimate law enforcement concerns, not racial bias. But Kessler's arguments fell flat when Sterling played the security footage from Rebecca's home. The jury watched in silence as Cain forced his way into her house, dismissed her credentials, and arrested her even when presented with clear evidence that she was who she claimed to be. The audio captured every word, every dismissive response, and every escalation of the illegal detention. The most devastating evidence came from Cain's own phone records and computer files. The prosecution displayed his detailed target lists on a large screen for the jury to see. Each file contained photographs, personal information, and assessment notes that had nothing to do with criminal activity and everything to do with success, visibility, and race. Dr. Franklin's testimony was particularly powerful. He described how Cain's repeated traffic stops had caused him to miss emergency surgeries, potentially putting patients' lives at risk. He told the jury about the humiliation of being placed in handcuffs on the side of the road while he was on his way to save someone's life in his surgical scrubs. His voice broke as he described having to explain to a patient's family why their loved one's surgery had been delayed because he had been detained for driving while black. Sarah Washington's testimony revealed the economic impact of the conspiracy. She presented evidence showing how the false reports Cain had filed with city agencies had cost her company more than $2 million in project delays and canceled contracts. She had been forced to lay off employees and abandon community development initiatives because of the fraudulent investigations Cain had initiated. Business owner Marcus Johnson testified about the psychological toll of being constantly targeted. He described the anxiety he felt every morning leaving his home, never knowing if today would be the day Cain would find another excuse to harass him. He had installed security cameras around his property and hired private security, spending thousands of dollars to protect himself from the people who were supposed to be protecting him. With each new witness, the prosecution's case grew stronger. Dorothy Evans, a teacher, described how Cain had shown up at her school, claiming to be investigating drug activity, and forced her to endure the humiliation of being questioned in front of her students and colleagues. No drugs were ever found because none existed. The entire incident had been designed to embarrass and intimidate her for speaking out about police misconduct at a city council meeting. Community leader Robert Hayes testified that Cain had tried to frame him for a crime he didn't commit. Cain had planted evidence during a traffic stop and filed a false report claiming that Hayes had been dealing drugs. Only the intervention of an honest patrol officer who had witnessed the evidence planting prevented Hayes from being wrongfully convicted and sent to prison. The text message evidence was devastating. Prosecutors displayed hundreds of messages between Cain and his co-conspirators discussing their targets, planning operations, and celebrating successful acts of harassment. The language was explicitly racist and showed a clear intent to violate civil rights. One particularly powerful exchange showed Cain bragging about making Dr. Franklin miss a surgery. He wrote that he loved watching successful black people squirm when they were reminded that they weren't really in charge. Another message was dedicated to Rebecca, with Cain saying he couldn't wait to show that uppity judge who really had the power in this town. The testimony of Rodriguez, who appeared as a cooperating witness, provided critical inside details on how the conspiracy operated. She had decided to plead guilty and testify truthfully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her lawyer had convinced her that cooperation was her only chance to avoid spending decades in federal prison. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Cain was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, while Rodriguez received 8 years for her cooperation. The other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 6 to 15 years. Their law enforcement careers were over, their pensions were forfeited, and their names would forever be associated with one of the most shameful chapters in police history. After the sentencing, Judge Rebecca Lawson stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by the victims who had found their voices and demanded justice. She spoke about how a single fabricated noise complaint had unraveled an entire web of corruption, proving that truth and accountability could triumph, even against those who believed they were untouchable. The case led to sweeping reforms in police departments across the country. New oversight mechanisms, mandatory body cameras, and civilian review boards became standard practice. Most importantly, it sent a clear message that a badge and a uniform did not provide immunity from the law. Rebecca served as a judge for another 10 years before retiring to write and speak about judicial reform. Cain served his full sentence and was released a broken man with no future. Sometimes, the system works exactly as it should, delivering consequences that match the crime. What began with a doorbell at 7:32 p.m. became a defining moment for civil rights and police accountability. Justice is not always swift, but when it arrives, it can be absolutely devastating for those who believe they are above the law. This case was intense, but the one on the right is even crazier.